It is my pleasure today to be able to introduce Professor Morgan Pitelka as our noon lecture series speaker. We have lured Professor Pitelka to frozen Michigan from UNC-Chapel Hill, where he is Professor of History and Asian Studies and the departmental chair, all of which I assume means you're really busy, so thank you for making time for us. Just by way of a brief intellectual biography, Professor Pitelka earned his PhD from Princeton in 2001, and since then has been extremely prolific. He has racked up a list of honors, including an NEH fellowship and a fellowship at the National Humanities Center that certainly makes me envious, and also has produced quite a few publications. I won't talk about all of them. I will restrict myself to his monographs, plural. I will tell you that the first one is Japanese Tea Culture, Art, History, and Practice, which came out in 2003, and sort of living the pre-modernist dream came out in paperback, I saw, which is in 2007. His second monograph, Handmade Culture, Raku Potters, Patrons, and Tea Practitioners in Japan, came out in 2005. There are so many, I can't even keep them straight. And his most recent monograph is the one I have here, Spectacular Accumulation, Material Culture, Tokugawa Ieyasu, and Samurai Sociability. And it, to borrow a phrase from the inside flap since it's more elegant than I could put it, it illustrates the close ties between people, things, and politics. And for me, as a text person, it was an especially valuable read because it engages with all of the things that circulate kind of above, behind, around, and between texts. So all of these things that I pretend are not out there, but are actually a very important part of performing authority in medieval and early modern Japan. He also has two forthcoming book projects, one of which is a co-authored collection and analysis of 23 letters from the 16th and 17th century that sheds a lot of light on how cultural practices that flourished in this time period were actually talked about by people in that time. So I think it's going to be a really valuable collection of primary sources. And then again, and on top of that, his other forthcoming book project is about the topic that he's going to be talking about today in his lecture. So on that note, I think I should just cede the floor because you are, after all, here to hear him and not me. So please join me in welcoming Professor Morgan Pitelka. Thank you.
Is it on? Is it okay? Okay, hi. I really appreciate the invitation to speak here. You have an amazing lineup of speakers every year, and it's a great honor to be one of them. I'm going to be talking today about a book that I'm trying to finish, which has the preliminary title of the talk. And I will try to give you a broad overview of its topic and its arguments. And I really look forward to your questions and feedback. The project is mostly finished, but the devil's in the details. So imagine that you are looking at the medieval city. I pressed the wrong button. There it is. Okay. Nope. Sorry. That's a good question. Look at the art historian spring into action. Okay. Got it. I think I just turned it on. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Imagine that you are in the medieval city of Ichijôdani, a community of roughly 10,000 people nestled in a valley in the northern region of Echizen Province in Japan. A doctor welcomes a patient into his large residential and clinical complex situated among temples and capacious warrior homes. The patient, who walked hours from her village south of the city, looks around at the large gate, the impressive decorated interior with wide eyes. The structures are even larger than the homes of the wealthiest village elders in her community. Then again, she is in the capital city, home to the lord of the province. She describes her symptoms to the doctor, who listens carefully and makes notes. Pain and vomiting in the morning, bad enough that she has found it difficult to work in the fields. She is young, she is away from her natal home, she is worried that she may be dying. Other than her husband, she has no one in her village to turn to. The doctor listens and then reassures her that her symptoms are consistent with morning sickness. She may be pregnant. She is relieved. His assistant serves the patient tea while the doctor consults his most prized possession, an imported Chinese text, Materia Medica of Decoctions, or the Tangye Bunsao, by the Chinese doctor Wang Haogu, written in the 13th century. This book contains encyclopedic explanations of ingredients and their effects. While perusing the text, he thinks of his own large store of medical materials. What does he need for this case? Is it licorice? No, perhaps not. Rhubarb root? No, not that. Finally, he finds it. Pinellia rhizome, the tuber of the plant Pinellia ternata, good for the suppression of nausea. He retrieves the dried ingredient from another one of his imported Chinese treasures, a lidded porcelain bowl, and he places it in his druggist's mortar and asks his assistant to grind it into a powder. He then uses a copper spoon to mix the ingredient and administer it to the patient from a spouted celadon bowl. He gives her a small packet of the medicine to use after she returns home until the morning sickness has passed. She drinks the concoction, thanks him profusely, pays him a small fee taken from her own carefully guarded but modest dowry, and departs. The doctor discusses the case with his assistant while drinking a bowl of tea and waits for his next patient. Now, the above scenario is speculative, to say the least, or the previous scenario is speculative because the city of Ichijôdani was almost completely destroyed by the armies of the warlord Oda Nobunaga in 1573. The people who lived in this thriving urban center fled or were ruthlessly killed, washing the streets of the provincial capital in blood. Written records of their lives are completely lost, with the exception, of course, of documents about Ichijôdani held in other locations, which are few. The elimination of the city and its residents was so thorough, in fact, that it was never resettled as an urban hub, but returned to a kind of originary state as an isolated and pastoral valley, dotted here and there by remains of the agglomeration that had once made it the most important city in the province. These ruins stood, largely untouched, until modern archaeologists became interested in the site as a potential source of information about medieval Japan. Preliminary digging occurred in the early 20th century, and thorough scientific excavations began in the 1960s. Those excavations continue today. As a result, although my description of the doctor's encounter with his patient is in one sense notional, in another sense it is based on tangible material evidence. We know, for example, that doctors' gates were built in the 16th century and served as an important marker of the entryway to doctors' residential and clinical complexes. And it turns out that we even know the exact text that was used by this doctor, and we have reason, which I'll show you in a moment, to believe that it existed in the city of Ichijôdani. So even though the city today is not a city at all, but a very rural, very isolated valley, it has been so thoroughly studied and excavated by archaeologists that we have found the doctor's residence and mapped the buildings and excavated the tools that he used. So everything in my description is in fact based on the archaeological evidence from this site. For example, the celadon dishes for preparing concoctions that have a spout so that after mixed it can be poured into another ceramic cup for drinking. The druggist's mortar, the yagen, for grinding the dried tuber into a powder so that it then could be mixed with liquid. And most amazing of all, the very rare find of fragments of a book that were identifiable enough for the actual text to be named and the exact passages to be located. This is unusual not only in an archaeological site, but in particular in an archaeological site that was destroyed by fire. The reason that the text or the fragments of the text survived is that it was being stored in a large Echizen ceramic vase that protected it partially from the flames. So the range of material evidence in Ichijôdani is startling. From domestically produced and imported ceramics to stone religious sculptures, from wood and metal tools to the remains of vegetable, marine, and animal foodstuffs. More than 50 years of excavations have revealed Ichijôdani's stone foundations, its roads and bridges, city gates, palace walls, cemeteries, tea houses, gardens, wells, and toilets. This panoply of material remains, which archaeologists have carefully mapped and reconstructed, endures as a rare archive of a historical community that is now lost. Many aspects of life in Ichijôdani are legible in these excavated edifices. Seemingly inconsequential objects like broken earthenware dishes, for example, reveal patterns of ritual behavior. Widely dispersed stone Buddha statues suggest the scope and depth of religious practice around death. Widely excavated Chinese and Korean ceramics point to patterns of trade and elite consumption of goods. The unearthed materials from Ichijôdani indeed transcend their seemingly static and passive state as artifacts. Instead, we can read them as constituent elements of the city of Ichijôdani, agents in the production of a space and a community that prospered for a century. The thriving city of Ichijôdani is the subject of the book that I'm trying to finish, which considers daily life in this provincial urban center in a period usually associated primarily with political incohesion and endemic warfare. My goal is to illuminate the rhythms and logic of life and death for the many medieval Japanese who lived in cities other than Kyoto and Kamakura. I'm also interested in the destruction of this provincial city and the meaning of that erasure for our understanding of both the period in which it took place and the larger flow of Japanese history. So briefly, how did Ichijôdani come to be? It was founded by the Asakura House of Warriors, and on the screen you see the last lord of the Asakura who ruled in the late 16th century. His ancestors made their headquarters in Ichijôdani in the 15th century. This family served the Shiba, another house of warriors, who were governors of Echizen Province and surrounding territories from at least the early 14th century. During the destructive Onin War of 1467 to 1477, which hinged in part on a conflict over the succession of the headship of the Shiba house, the Asakura switched sides and effectively displaced their masters as rulers of Echizen. For 5 generations, the Asakura governed the province from this growing city, safely nestled in a valley about 20 miles inland, while also maintaining regular contact with cultural and political institutions in Kyoto, which is about 100 miles to the south. They lived in the Sengoku, or Warring States period. But it turns out for the Asakura and for their subjects, this was an age defined less by war and more by stability and prosperity. It was, in fact, the rise of Nobunaga, the warlord who is often called the first unifier, and his grandiose attempts to pacify the realm in his own name that led to the destruction of Ichijôdani. The Asakura were killed, the city was destroyed, and the valley of Ichijôdani became a deserted site. Unfortunately, the focus of historians has almost universally pivoted quickly from the moment of the destruction of Ichijôdani to the world building of Nobunaga and his peers that follows as a kind of historical inevitability. The lives and deaths of 10,000 people in Ichijôdani and hundreds of thousands across Japan in this period the lives and deaths of all these people are subsumed into the larger narrative of progress toward the modern under the guise of unification, a seemingly necessary precondition for both early modernity and modern Japan. Indeed, thinking about the flow of Japanese history as a teacher, I find it hard to resist the urge to leap forward from the destruction of Ichijôdani in 1573 to Nobunaga's remarkable string of victories that follows it. His defeat of the Takeda in 1582, for example. And then to the rise of Hideyoshi, the second unifier, and his remarkable pacification of the entire Japanese archipelago. His assault on Korea, his war with Korea and Ming China in 1592, the victory of Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1600, the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1603. My heart quickens even saying these names, and I've indeed written a book about these stories. Few periods contain more drama on an epic scale than the late 16th century. But what if we counter the teleological pressure to rush forward through this story of unification, and instead allow our thoughts to linger on the rhythms of daily life in a provincial city like Ichijôdani before its destruction? What would result from a slow and careful consideration of the archaeological evidence, the landscape of the city, the relations among its residents, the deployments of power of the Asakura over the agglomeration of Ichijôdani, indeed the city's religious and cultural practices, and then in light of that slow, careful consideration, the destruction of the community in 1573, what results would such a study produce? That's what I'm hoping to answer in this book. And I try to propose the following. First, I think the material remains in Ichijôdani contain a deep and profound message regarding life in late medieval Japan. Second, the mainstream historical narratives of pre-modern Japan are compromised by their failure to take seriously the diversity of experiences in places like these provincial urban cities, and by truly accounting for their destruction. Rehabilitating the worldview of the residents of Ichijôdani and incorporating it into our understanding of the Japanese medieval is, I think, a vital step in resisting the normalization of an anachronistic and monolithic view of Japanese national identity that I think has pernicious ramifications for the world that we live in today. The unification of Japan in the late 16th century was not preordained. Rather, it was contingent and contested. So, I'm going to talk you through three of the main themes of the book. They are all signposted in the title of the book. So, urban life, material history, and destruction and the production of ruins. So first, urban life. The mention of urban life in medieval Japan, of course, immediately evokes images of Kamakura, the headquarters of the first warrior government from 1192 to 1333, and Kyoto, the great imperial capital since 794 and the headquarters of the second warrior government after 1336. These were unquestionably the largest and most significant cities in medieval Japan. Yet their prominence, I think, has been exaggerated by the tendency even of writers at the time to use them as signifiers of the larger polities they harbored. Medieval authors often substituted place names for institutions, a habit that is revealing in terms of the power relations that we can find in these linguistic practices, but I also think it produces a documentary record that ends up overemphasizing Kamakura and Kyoto as the center of all meaningful action in the medieval world. When people want to talk about the actions of the warrior government in the 13th century, they sometimes will just refer broadly to the place. And the city, as a result, is reinscribed again and again and again in the historical record, and I think in our historical imagination. Indeed, we tend to think of whole swaths of Japanese history in reductionist geographical terms. When we imagine the Heian period, I think we rarely stray beyond the boundaries of the city of Heiankyo. Our perception of the diarchy of shared power between the imperial court and the first warrior government during the Kamakura period likewise means we concentrate on Kyoto and Kamakura. There is some rich scholarship on other parts of Japan in the medieval period, from John Whitney Hall's foundational work on Echizen Province to Carol Richmond Song's work on the leagues, the Ikoiki, to Michigan's own Peter Shapinsky's amazing work on the sea lords of the inland sea. Fortunately, we have lots of great historical scholarship that ventures outside of the boundaries of these two mighty cities. But there's not a lot of work on other cities. And indeed, Japan was relatively urbanized for a medieval society, even in the period of time that I'll be talking about today, the 15th to the 16th centuries. Now, in Japanese scholarship, the picture is completely different. There is a remarkable, deep literature on medieval cities that, not coincidentally, combines the disciplines of history and archaeology. In the late 1980s, for example, Amino Yoshihiko, the incredibly influential social and cultural historian of the medieval world, or really all of pre-modern Japan, collaborated with Ishii Susumu and Fukuda Tomohiko on a series of multi-author anthologies that sought to explore and promote this emerging vision of medieval Japan informed by archaeological excavations. It was called Yomigaeru Chusei, or Restoring the Medieval. And it helped elevate the status of medieval archaeology, which had until that time been seen as a very minor subfield underneath the much more important topic of Jomon and Yayoi studies, basically, the exploration of early Japanese archaeology. The preface to Yomigaeru Chusei notes that, quote, medieval and early modern sites have been discovered and investigated across the country, and although this information will not become big news like the discovery of Kofun, tomb mounds, or ancient imperial sites, for modern people these sites are closer to us and can teach us matters of importance. I think what Amino, who I believe wrote that preface, is gesturing at here is what we can think of as the affect of things, the power of material culture to be recognizable and to create some kind of sense of universal or shared experience that can be illusory, and historians and archaeologists can pop the bubble of universalism, but can also be generative and can help us to understand the past in deeply personal ways. There are volumes on the port city of Hakata, for example, that argue that Japan was not an isolated archipelago, but part of a regional community that included the Northeast Asian maritime community. There's a wonderful volume on Kamakura as the first warrior's capital, and a number of other key sites, including Ichijôdani, are explored in these volumes. Out of this came a whole tree, a kind of flowering tree of further collaborations between historians and archaeologists that rippled across the 1980s and 90s up to the present, so that there are now major symposia and conferences held every year in all the different regions of Japan and at the national level, looking at the link between medieval archaeology and medieval history. One of my favorite of these, in terms of the products that it produced, is another collaboration between Amino Yoshihiko and Ishii Susumu, the 7-volume series called Chusei no Fuke o Yomu, Reading the Landscape of the Medieval. And in fact, the title of the book, Reading Medieval Ruins, is borrowed partially from that Amino and Ishii anthology. The goal of that series was less explicitly to introduce archaeological evidence, but instead to use a multidisciplinary approach in order to emphasize the diversity of medieval Japan, which is one of Amino's themes. Also, or kind of as an extension of that, the relationship between Japan and the Asian continent, and this is pursued through the study of 5 themes: cities, villages, belief, trade, and artisans. What I find astounding is that very little of this literature, or the rich primary sources that it's based on, has made any impact on medieval studies in the Anglophone world. We could have tons of dissertations and countless monographs and edited volumes, I think, building on the work of our colleagues in Japan and collaborating with them. And surprisingly, we don't. And even the work of Amino Yoshihiko, some of which has been translated into English, it always is the other stuff, his work that isn't focused on medieval cities, that ends up being translated into English for reasons that I'm sure it's obvious to you are completely unfathomable to me. So I hope this book will start to introduce some of those materials into the English literature on medieval Japan. But the focus for me is really on the idea that there was urban life outside of Kyoto and Kamakura, and that life was rich, and that the material evidence paints a lively picture of the medieval urban world of Ichijôdani and cities like it. So here, for example, you see a photograph of one of the neighborhoods in Ichijôdani after it was excavated, and then a kind of schematic map that archaeologists have produced to show us how different properties were divided using, obviously, the remains of the boundary walls and retainer walls. And you can see on the left side of the image extremely large properties that were warrior households. Some of them have multiple wells and toilets. And on the right, especially on the lower right, you see urban commoner dwellings that are significantly smaller, clustered together. They don't have big gardens, and they're located closer to the river that runs through the valley of the Ichijo River. And there's all kinds of amazing mapping of urban life that we can do using the archaeological remains from Ichijôdani. But one of the points I wanted to make is that Ichijôdani is almost always referred to in the literature as a castle town. And this word castle town is a bad translation. This phrase castle town is a bad translation of the Japanese term joukamachi. And you can tell just by looking at it, if you can read kanji, that the English translation is insufficient, right? Because the Japanese word really reads town below the castle. And even the word castle, jo here, but shiro, in the original Chinese context could also mean city. So the Japanese version, when translated into English, easily communicates the idea of an urban community that grows up around a military fortress. The Japanese version implies the military fortress is elevated, but in English we lose that entirely, right? And the castle town is a good term to describe the domainal centers of the Tokugawa period, when you have a single castle that is both a military fortress and an administrative hub, and then a town that grows up around it that becomes the capital of the domain. But many of the medieval cities that I'm interested in don't really fit the model of the castle town at all. Particularly, I think, Ichijôdani, because the town and the castle are entirely disconnected. The castle, you can't even see in the picture because it's so far away on top of a mountain and is completely separate. It is an emergency location that the warrior family could, in theory, retreat to in times of military necessity, although they did not do that when Nobunaga's armies came calling and they all died as a result. So it's in some ways almost more of a symbolic structure than an actual functioning military fortress that plays an important role of the administration of the province. Instead, the town is built around the residence of the Asakura, the palatial residence. And this is mildly fortified, but really is closer to a palace than it is to a castle. So through collaboration with urban historians who work on Europe and the Middle East, I was introduced to the idea of the palace city, which is a phrase used to describe the urban agglomerations that grew up around the palatial residences of sultans, in cities like Constantinople, or the many cities that mimicked the design of Constantinople. The palace city may be a better phrase, a better description of a city like Ichijôdani than the castle town. Unfortunately, the most famous books about Ichijôdani in Japanese all are titled Sengoku Joukamachi, Ichijôdani nani nani nani. So they all say castle town of the Warring States period, Ichijôdani. It is so ingrained in the identity of the site that I think it's a losing battle to try to rebrand it. But I think it's more interesting to think about this as a provincial city or a palace city, indeed, than just a kind of set of services that grew up to service the military lords of the province. Another note, and this is very much building on the work of Amino and Ono Masatoshi, an archaeologist who I've learned a lot from and worked with, is that if we limit ourselves to the town, which is demarcated by, or the city, demarcated by the upper gate and the lower gate, then we're missing half of the action. The reasons to do this, of course, are that the residence, the palace, and here's the gate, the front gate, or it's not actually the front gate, it's a kind of side gate of the palace, is still extant. The palace itself had 3 gates and then was guarded on this side by the mountains. So it has a south gate, a west gate, and north gate. I'm not going to go into all the details of the buildings just because I don't have time. But it's a really fascinating building that we can relate to other palaces in Japan, including shogunal palaces in Kyoto. And this is clearly the center of the city. It's the site of a lot of really important ritual activity, administrative work, so on and so forth. But first of all, we have multiple other neighborhoods. So here we have the Hirai district, which is home to many of the largest warrior residences. It's across the river from the Asakura family palace. Here we have the Akabuchi district, which is where a number of the urban commoner dwellings and shops were located. So you could do all kinds of interesting shopping in this neighborhood. And the excavations have revealed the products that were sold. And I had so much fun writing about, for example, the Buddhist bead maker who had his tiny little house and shop. This shows his entire property. He slept and worked all in this space, producing these various beads out of various materials that were strung together almost in something like a rosary that pilgrims and practitioners could buy on their way to the temples in Ichijôdani. Tons of examples of this kind of work from the excavations. So we have all of that. But Ichijôdani also has neighborhoods outside of the castle gates. So I know this is hard to read and it's in Japanese, but the purple represents the town as demarcated by the gates, right? The city gates, which in the Japanese literature are called the castle gates. It just drives me nuts. Anyway, they're the city gates. But then we have many additional neighborhoods that follow the valley to the south and the tributary here, but most importantly, along the river. So the Ichijo River empties into the very large and important Asuwa River, the main river of Echizen Province, which empties out into the ocean and is the river that Fukui, which is the capital of the modern-day prefecture and was the historic capital of Echizen Province, is built around. Essentially, the trade between the Asuwa River and the maritime world made that location a hub. So where the Ichijo River meets the Asuwa River, we have all of these unregulated neighborhoods. These are exactly the types of communities that Amino Yoshihiko has written about when he talks about these interstitial places and people who move that are not connected to a specific institution, that are vital to medieval commerce, medieval social and cultural life. We have a lot of evidence from Ichijôdani that this neighborhood, Abaka, that's right. This neighborhood of Abaka here was a lively mercantile district that was home to these in-between people, including, according to one document, a population of Chinese merchants. And this is designated in the medieval Japanese sources as a Tojin no machi, right? A community of Tang Dynasty people, right? That's the way that in this period Chinese migrant laborers and merchants were described. And we also have records of vessels, trading vessels from China calling at the port that is where Fukui is now located. So this is a way in which Ichijôdani is connected not only to the entire province of Echizen and the whole region, but indeed to the international region that Japan is a part of. Not, it turns out, an isolated valley at all. So those are just a few examples of some of the rich details that the excavations have yielded. But of course, they do so through the unearthing and analysis of objects. Objects made of stone, objects made of ceramic, and miraculously also objects made of wood, metal, lacquer, and even in a few rare circumstances, as I've already said, paper. And those objects, I think, are powerful and significant historical sources that we can read. One of the really interesting examples of the types of sources I'm trying to use in this project that have largely been ignored by Anglophone scholars includes, these types of stone Buddhas and stone stupas, which are called sekibutsu and sekito in Japanese, which are pretty ubiquitous in medieval sites. And of course, I think it's possible at one level to say beautiful but irrelevant. They're just grave markers. They're just gravestones. People die. Other people put stones where they died, and sort of shrug your head. But there is, I think, some interesting research being done in Japan on the remarkable clusters of these stone Buddhas and stone pagodas in sites like Ichijôdani. And fortunately for me, archaeologists have mapped every stone Buddha and pagoda that has been found in Ichijôdani, and it totals more than 2,800 objects. Many of them have inscriptions that provide a date to the time of the ceremony, the death ceremony that the object is associated with. Most numerous of all are the objects that are referred to as five-ringed towers, or gorinto. Even this object here, even though it only has three elements, is gesturing in the direction of a five-ringed tower and is carved out of a single block of stone. There are 1,577 of these, and these are part of the important tradition of the stupa, of course, in Asian Buddhism. Some of them are made out of separate stones, but they're much more fragile, so they tend to get separated and are easily misidentified or lost. Stone Buddhas are the second most numerous. There's 860 stone Buddhas extant, and they come in either single statues, like this one that we see here. Sometimes there are two or three. Many different configurations, an Amida triad. Sometimes you have two bodhisattvas. All kinds of interesting connections can be made by reading the inscriptions on the statues. And of course, these statues are an important part of medieval mortuary ritual practices. And I think that they give us a glimpse of the religious activities of the people who lived in the city of Ichijôdani. So the five-ringed tower, the gorinto, for example, derives its religious significance from the long history in the Buddhist tradition of the idea of the stupa as a reliquary, a container for holy objects, even a container for bodily fragments associated with the historical Buddha. The stupa originated in South Asia as a site for pilgrimage and enactment of ritual. It, of course, transformed as it traveled, gaining new shapes because of new local traditions of both architecture and belief. In East Asia, stupas developed into multi-tiered architectural structures, pagodas, wooden towers with multiple eaves, still thought of as reliquaries, but containing not only relics associated with the Buddha, but a whole range of different Buddhist treasures. And here in the stone five-ring tower that is, of course, in fact made of a single block of stone, the idea that this contains something is lost, right? This is no longer a literal container for a relic, but a metaphorical device that plays a ritual role and becomes a marker for the believer, for the practitioner. They tend to be concentrated on the edges of the town's more remote Buddhist temple complexes. And when they are found inside of the city, they are usually clustered at the backs of the urban temples, forming mini graveyards, essentially. But we've located, archaeologists have located the crematorium in Ichijôdani, so we know where the dead went to pass on into the next world, so we can start to inscribe a kind of route that followed the body of the dead as it was cared for by the living. And I'm really interested in trying to understand those rhythms over the course of this project. Okay, I'm going to go on. I'm running a little short on time here. Oh no, I have to mention this. So another important type of object that is excavated in mind-numbingly massive quantities in Ichijôdani is the earthenware ritual vessel, or kawarake. These are the most important ceramics that you never hear about in pre-modern Japan. These vessels are used for a huge range of ritual activities. Most notably, they're used in warrior rituals of greeting and exchange. So when two elite warriors meet to work out their relative rank, to exchange gifts, there is usually one or more rounds of the exchange of sake. And the sake is served in these earthenware vessels, and then the vessels are broken. So they're one-time, one-use objects that preserves the purity, in theory, of the ritual action. And you can actually calculate where warriors really did their work, essentially, right? The ritual political work of these encounters by looking at the concentration of these vessels. They also could be used for burning candles in a non-warrior ritual context. They may have been used by the doctor for serving certain types of medicines where you didn't want to reuse the plate afterwards. And in particular, there's huge numbers of them found at this one temple site called Nanyoji, which, as you can see from the map, is located right next to the Asakura family residence or palace. And the archaeologists who've studied this site believe that it was used less for religious rituals and more for social gatherings, that it became a place for tea ceremonies and banquets. And indeed, we have a record of Ashikaga Yoshiaki, who ends up becoming the last shogun of the medieval period, visiting the Asakura in the 16th century and coming to Nanyoji Temple for a banquet and gift exchange that lasted more than 12 hours. And I lost count after 17 exchanges of sake between Ashikaga Yoshiaki and the Asakura. And that happened at this site using those earthenware vessels. So nobody wants to publish catalogs of these ceramics. And you very rarely see them displayed in museums. They're produced by essentially anonymous, low-status artisans. They are everywhere and therefore essentially invisible. But there's some interesting work being done on them now in Japan. There are two things written about them in English. Louise Court, my mentor from the Smithsonian, has a chapter about them in a book called What's the Use of Art? And David Spafford, the medieval historian, uses kawarake in his study of space and place in the Kanto. So there's more and more attention being paid to them, but still, every time I look at the excavation reports from Ichijôdani, I'm overwhelmed by how many of them are excavated there, and still struggling to make sense of the volume and what it tells us about life in this city. All right, so lastly, the idea of ruins. This was, of course, a city that was destroyed, as I've mentioned many times. And instead of glossing over that as just a natural product of unification, you've got some winners and some losers. What are you going to do, right? We all want peace, and you just have to kill 10 or 100,000 people along the way. That's the way it works. Instead of engaging in that kind of, hidden rationalization, I really want to pay attention to the destruction of Ichijôdani. And I also want to pay attention to the complete lack of attention to the destruction of Ichijôdani in the site itself. So this is part of the reconstruction of Ichijôdani that you can visit when you go to this wonderful site outside of Fukui today. Archaeologists who often reconstruct things in order to help students and visitors to understand and to be able to visualize the past have reconstructed the streets following very carefully the evidence that they excavated. And it becomes a kind of museum that's being kind of generous with the word museum. It's more like a theme park, to be honest. It's closer to Disneyland than it is to a museum. And it becomes the site for cosplay and festivals that are fun but completely anachronistic. And it's a kind of canvas on which people project their fantasies about the Sengoku period. And as we know, people have a lot of fantasies about the Sengoku period. So it worries me because the fact that it was wiped out by a warlord and his armies is not mentioned anywhere in the site. And the death of the residents of the city is ignored. And I think this is pretty consistent with the historiography of the three unifiers. And the very idea that the work that they engaged in, that the labor was unifying rather than destroying, is biased. And it inherently represents a kind of pro-nation-state teleology that I think should be contested. So one small anecdote from the history of the Asakura, the rulers of Ichijôdani. Sorry that text is cut off there. The font changed. The destruction of Mount Hiei. This is relatively well known. The warlord Oda Nobunaga, in his quest to unify Japan, it's often said, just sort of randomly burned down all the temples on Mount Hiei because he was a heathen. But what actually happened is that the Asakura and their allies, the Asai, these two warlord families from Echizen and Omi, created a network of anti-Nobunaga allies that were going to coordinate a strike against the Oda Lord and take Kyoto back from his hands and try to fix the wrongs that he had committed. And they launched an invasion of the Kinai region, and he responded much more quickly than they had anticipated. They took the port city of Sakamoto on Lake Biwa, which is just below Mount Hiei, and they then ended up having to retreat up the mountain when Nobunaga's armies came to assault them. And Nobunaga told the monks of Mount Hiei, give us the Asakura and the Azai leaders in your midst, give us access to the temples and the forests so that we can, continue this quote-unquote unification effort, the creation of the peaceful realm in the name of Nobunaga. And the monks refused. So he said, we'll be back. Eventually, the court negotiated a settlement between the armies of the Asakura and the Asai and the armies of Nobunaga. Everybody withdrew, and then Nobunaga came back. He destroyed the city of Sakamoto and all of its residents. He burned down all of the temples and shrines on the mountain. And then he formed a perimeter ring of his soldiers so that they could see each other, and they all had arquebuses, they had guns, and he had them slowly walk up from the base of the mountain to be sure that any man, woman, or child in any bush or tree or buried in mud or hiding in a cave was found and shot. And it was what I think of as his genocidal instinct. This is total war, total elimination of all people associated with his enemies, including civilians. So the destruction of Mount Hiei, which is, again, somewhat well known because even in the West, burning down an entire holy site with thousands of practicing priests is kind of unusual, although not unheard of. But this is, in fact, only a foreshadowing of the destruction of Ichijôdani and many other communities that follows it. And I use this image, which is from a later battle, the Summer Siege of Osaka from 1615. But I use it because it illustrates a point I want to make, which is that warfare in this period, again, was total war. And you see here civilians, women, children, men who are not samurai fleeing from armed soldiers who are killing them and taking their stuff. And that's the way war operated in this period. It's, of course, the way war often operates. But it was very explicitly the goal of these campaigns to capture prisoners if they were useful, keep them as slaves or hostages. If they were not useful, kill them and take their clothes, their jewels, their goods, their treasured items, whatever. And in particular, the bodies of women and children were valued because they could be exchanged. They could be sold. They could be kept as hostages. If the woman was attractive, turned into a concubine or a house assistant. And there is an anecdote from the destruction of Ichijôdani in which a woman of the Asakura family is trying to flee the destruction of the city. And she is set upon by two of Nobunaga's soldiers. And the trope of women being unable to escape a battle is a literary theme. But it's interesting, and actually Professor Tonomura's writing about accounts of sexual violence has been really helpful to me in trying to understand this. Usually that trope is masculinist in that it doesn't care about the experience of the woman. The woman fleeing from an invading army is not a metaphor, it's an indictment of the failure of the leader, right? A samurai ruler has failed if his women are forced to flee invading soldiers. It's the ultimate sign that you have lost your authority and you've lost your manhood, right? The women and their experiences are incidental. But this account in one of the war tales about the destruction of Ichijôdani is different from that. It says this woman is captured and imprisoned by these two soldiers of Nobunaga's for 3 to 5 days. And that at the end of that, she was so distraught that she threw herself into a well and committed suicide. And I think this is fairly obviously an account of something that happened ubiquitously in the wars of this time, which is torture and rape of women. And to forget the destruction of Ichijôdani, to write the destruction of the community out of history by jumping from its thriving 1570s urban life to, but later Nobunaga built Azuchi Castle and it had really pretty paintings, right? And then later Tokugawa Ieyasu established the Tokugawa shogunate and we became modern, right? To kind of steamroll over these communities that were lost and these lives that were lost, and the story of women like this Asakura lady who is identified, who's not identified, but whose story is told in unusual detail in this war tale, I think is to do a profound injustice to the medieval period and its end. It worries me a lot that even in displays that I really appreciate, this display is in the National Museum of Japanese History, Rekihaku, in room number 2, which is the room that displays the medieval world. In the section about warlords and leagues or uprisings, one of the main displays is a model of the Asakura residence. And the destruction of the Asakura in 1573, the destruction of the city, is not mentioned. It is a slight exaggeration to say, if this is the Museum of Japanese History, then the destruction of Ichijôdani didn't happen. I think that's a shame. And more than a shame, it prevents us from understanding the transformation that really occurred with the Tokugawa settlement and the remaking of the world as an early modern one, with the threat of violence hovering constantly over the lives of people in early modern Japan, and the memory of the Sengoku killing fields, as I'm starting to think of them, in the not too distant past. So the study of the material history of the ruins of Ichijôdani, I think, offers us a really wonderful opportunity to use the affect of things, to use the power of these excavated objects to tell a different story about medieval Japan, and to complicate national identity in the ways that historians like Amino Yoshihiko have challenged us to do. That's what I hope to accomplish in this book. This map, which I used at the beginning of the talk, is actually an Edo period map. It shows Ichijôdani, but it shows the already reinvented, nostalgic fantasy of Ichijôdani as a rural place of ghosts and ruins. And it's beautiful. and I will do everything in my power to put it on the cover of my book, but it has to also be situated in a period when the wars of the Sengoku age have become the epic stories of romance, rather than the real visceral tales of the destruction of communities. Thank you.
So we do have time for some quick Q&A, so please raise your hand if you have a question, and the mics will come to you.
Thank you so much for a fascinating talk.
Thank you.
What you said at the end was working with a question that I was having throughout the presentation, which was, what about moments of violence? So if we're having this kind of fantasy imagination of moments of incredible destruction and violence that are ignored and minimized, there also the inverse happens a lot too, right? And so I'm thinking of actually like Iwo Jima and sort of the narratives, I mean an American narrative of Iwo Jima, I should say, and moments when violence is highlighted and emphasized and really used in the national re-narrativization, or however we want to say it, right? And so I understand this is beyond the scope of the project and is probably more related to your earlier work, but I was just wondering what you think about that, how that gets made, and what that, I guess, is the end of the question.
No, it's a great question. Thank you so much. The tension between the nostalgia of poets in this period for the Genpei War that ended the Heian period, right, and led to the rise of warrior power in a sense, while the world around them is suffering, in some ways, a far worse fate in terms of the loss of civilian lives, is very mysterious to me.
Arguably what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
Like in this moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I'm still trying to understand it. And when I first started talking about this project, I was using a lot of poems by wonderful medieval poets who would go to a site where some battle had happened in the Genpei War and then, write these beautiful, nostalgic, and kind of romantic poems about memories of these beautiful Taira warriors or whatever. And I thought I could sort of use that to say, why isn't the same aesthetic framework and memorialization through cultural production happening around the late 16th century or the Sengoku period? I think you could argue that it is in the Edo period, right? That in the war tales, in the fetishization of the unifiers, right? The legends that grow up around Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Ieyasu, in the deification of Hideyoshi and Ieyasu, in the cult of the worship of Ieyasu as Tosho Daigongen, you have different iterations of that, but I think they're very different. I mean, those are kind of weaponized by various institutions for very specific purposes, whereas in the widespread celebration of the heroes of the Genpei War, you have a much more of a bottom-up culture that's not institutionally controlled and mandated, I think. So yeah, I'm still trying to work that out, and I would love the insights of the many experts in pre-modern Japan who are here. But thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. I am interested in the comparison between Western Europe of that time, the 16th century, with this period of Japan. Can you give us some views?
Yeah. Well, my knowledge of European history is pretty bad, so I apologize for that. But I have been engaged in a collaborative study project with scholars of palace cities in Europe and in the Middle East. We've held a few symposia and conferences to look at, overlapping patterns and relationships. And I think that there are a lot of examples of small cities that have multiple functions, an administrative function, a military function, a commercial function, a religious function, at about the same time. So one interesting example is Budapest. Budapest, which is now a great European city, of course, the capital of Hungary, in this period was about the same size as Ichijôdani. It had about a population of about 10,000 people. It was divided by a river, but a much bigger river, and Buda and Pest, the two communities that make up Budapest as one city today, were then sort of related, but sometimes at odds. So I was able to visit that site. It is much more closely associated with art and culture and politics than with war, the way that Ichijôdani and other jokamachi or castle towns are associated with the power of warlords. But I think that has to do much more with the way historians have talked about these cities than the reality at the time. Another interesting small city that I've looked at as a comparison is actually in England. It's Norwich, which is to the east of London, close to the coast. It's where the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures is located. So a lot of people in our field have gone and stayed there to do research. And Norwich was a thriving medieval city that at one point had a population of about 10,000 people, but at other points had a much bigger population. But it was built around a castle and a cathedral. So in Christian cities, obviously, you often have this dual political and religious function where you have one church or cathedral and one main administrative center. Part of what's interesting about Ichijôdani is you have dozens of temples and shrines. So the religious authority is spread out. And instead of having a kind of diarchy between, or a kind of dual kenmon structure where you have one political center and one religious center, you have the Asakura residence and then all these different religious sites around it. So I find that interesting. Those are just a few limited observations, but thank you. I'm trying to think comparatively, and I really think it's important that we not isolate Japan from the rest of the world and think about it in a global context. There's one over here. Tonomura Sensei.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Yeah. So I was thinking about representations of warriors in general, and your mention about Ichijôdani itself at Rekihaku, and so they reconstructed, and they didn't want to show the battle scene or anything, which they don't have because they are excavating materials that were left. So I have, so the first question, I'm sorry, but I have a couple of questions.
Good.
First question has to do with what you think about other, at Rekihaku, other representations of various battles and so on, which are all totally male-centered. In other words, in battles, there are no females. So they want to show male glory, whether it's miserable or not, being killed. But it's the glory of warfare, battles, combat, and so on. So it has a very different kind of message. And women should not be there, whether they're fighting or not working. But in this Ichijôdani reconstruction, did they put humans in there? Did they put? Okay, so it's just the structure.
Yeah.
All right, so they are not showing people.
Yeah.
Okay, so that makes me wonder what they're thinking in terms of male-female relationships. But it is very different in their thinking in comparison to battle scenes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that's one thing. That
Okay.
maybe it's a comment. And then comment. The other is a question about jokamachi. So, as you mentioned, jokamachi is often used for Tokugawa period cities. And I personally can't remember. I was trying to think, but I couldn't remember. If the word is used in medieval documents, I couldn't remember seeing it ever.
Yeah.
And so I'm asking you, is it a word that historians are using, or is it in sources?
Yeah.
And the word itself, jo, that character, I think that appears, but not so frequently. And the concept of this jokamachi, maybe not really present there in contemporary sources?
No, I have not seen it used in contemporaneous sources related to Ichijôdani. I'm wondering about Azuchi, Nobunaga's castle. I wonder if it was used in reference to that community, and I don't know. And if I'm going to write about why Ichijôdani shouldn't be called a castle town, I need to have a little bit of history of the phrase, so I will do that. I mean, I have been reading the history of the character, Shiro, castle, and I think it's so interesting that in the early Chinese context, it didn't just mean fortification. It could mean a city, and it is sort of understood that a city is fortified, and so I want to try to understand better how that the meaning of that character and the words that it's embedded in changed in medieval Japan over time, but I haven't done that work yet. So. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Let me look into that. Thank you so much. Yes. No. Yeah. Thank you. There's one up here.
Thank you for your talk. I want to ask a question about this sort of representation, or what were you trying to problematize in your project? This sort of reinvented fantasy, or the sort of overwhelming narrative of unification versus the actual reality of the ruins and destruction. And I'm glad that you refer or compare back to the Gensei War and this sort of rich trope and culture of the lamenting the previous death. And I was thinking the particular part of Fujiwara no Shinzai when he wrote a poem about this. Not he wrote a poem, but he included his disciples' poem in his anthology, and sort of, but it was placed as anonymous. So you have this trope of Chinkong or and so on. But it seems a completely different case in the Sengoku period. You don't really have this sort of narrative or retelling the past.
Yeah.
And the lamentation of those deaths. So I wonder, like, how you want to sort of unpack or breaking through those overwhelming unification narratives.
So, thank you so much. Thanks. At one point early in this project, I thought that, I had the original idea of talking about 16th century losers. And then a bunch of people smarter than me published books about losers in Japanese history. There actually two came out, one about Meiji period losers and one about one co-edited book. One of the editors was Mickey Adelson, about various celebrated losers. And of course there's the old Ivan Morris book, The Nobility of Failure, right? So this is an idea that has a lot of currency, I think, in the study of Japanese culture. The lack of attention to the destruction of Ichijôdani reminds me a little bit of the lack of attention to some of the grisly work of war. So in my last book that you so kindly introduced, I talk a lot about these head examination ceremonies, the kubi-jiken, that happen at the end of big battles, where the victorious commander calls his generals forward and they bring the heads of the highest ranking enemies that they defeated, and they've cut off or had their soldiers cut off the head so they can show. And I talk about this as a kind of almost like a review of labor. It's an accounting of the work of the day, and yet those kubi-jiken are very rarely written about, and there's a lot of documentary evidence related to Kubijiken because in the Tokugawa period, warriors who had participated in Sekigahara or the Osaka castle battles who didn't get to take part in those head examination ceremonies felt that their efforts weren't being acknowledged. So they would write these letters saying, I have evidence that I took 10 heads from whatever opposing force, and yet I did not receive an increase in land allotment. My family is now suffering because our efforts were not rewarded. And here are my witnesses, right? Here are the people who saw me take these. And there's a lot of, and you never see those letters published. They're not in document collections usually. You never see them framed. You know how people love to frame the letters from warlords? You're never going to see Kubi-related letters framed because they're grisly and they're gross, So I wonder if the destruction of communities by the unifiers, and there's many of them, right? I mean, Ichijôdani is just one, fall into a related category of sort of the unpleasant labor of war that we can sort of set aside because what really matters is the creation of these institutions that ultimately bring about peace and stability. Mount Hiei is an exception because it's a sacred space. It has beautiful temples that are destroyed and priceless artifacts that are lost. And I think everyone agrees that that is just egregious, right? But all of it is, I think, in my opinion, the destruction of Ichijôdani is at the same level as the destruction of Mount Hiei, and that we need to see those actions as being of one piece. This sort of genocidal militarism that is the hallmark of the late 16th century unification effort. I mean, it shouldn't matter to us as historians that, well, I don't know. I don't think it should matter to us that what ends up happening in the 17th century is peace and stability. It's still violence on a previously unseen scale that affects civilians as much as it does soldiers. I think I avoided answering the question, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
So I hope we have time for one more question. So I was wondering, as someone who works on, as you know, a slightly earlier period where things that are written from a position of aspirational centrality are grounding themselves in Kyoto and Kamakura, and those being very central sites for mobilizing ideas of authority. And so I was wondering, okay, so if they're not really as important as I like to think that they are, or as the writers that I'm looking at are depicting them as, how does what we're getting out of Ichijôdani relativize that? And what are we seeing there that we're not? How can I reimagine this outside of the world of text?
Thank you. So let me give an example of how these provincial cities are currently talked about and why I think it's problematic in a way that I hope will answer the question. So a lot of the writings about Ichijôdani in Japanese, I mean, there isn't anything really written in English, so anyway, but in Japanese, describe it as a little Kyoto. And you have this idea that in the 16th century, various kind of copies, these small, sort of funny copies of Kyoto pop up around the country. You know, these silly warlords trying to act like they're courtiers or shoguns, right? And it's very patronizing. But what I see happening in Ichijôdani, both in terms of the material history of the city and in the documentary evidence about the ritual practices that occur in the city, is a shared, spread out negotiation of political instability. So the Ashikaga shogunate, of course, loses its authority at the time of the Onin War, largely because of the ineptitude of Ashikaga Yoshimasa. But there are still Ashikaga shoguns who try to navigate the tumultuous waters of these predatory warlords. And ultimately, you know, the last of those men, Yoshiaki, after his brother brother, uncle, is assassinated after Yoshiteru is assassinated, and he decides, well, I'm going to find a warrior patron who's going to help me reestablish the Ashikaga shogunate. He comes to the Asakura after trying several other people, and while he's also writing to various other warlords around Japan to try to, curry favor with them. And he spends almost a year in Ichijôdani. And there's all these rituals, all these ceremonies, all these cultural practices that happen there. And of course, would he rather be spending his time in Kyoto? Yes, he would, but if he had been there, he would have been assassinated. And he is negotiating for patronage while also bestowing privileges. So for example, the mother of the last Asakura lord, who's a very important political figure in Ichijôdani, is given a higher court rank by Ashikaga Yoshiaki because he has that power because of his connection to the court through the position of shogun. Well, he's not technically shogun yet, but his family connection. So there's and throughout its history, people from Kyoto come to Ichijôdani, and people from Ichijôdani go to Kyoto, not only in a sense of, I'm going to go to Kyoto so I can figure out the stuff to copy, right? It's a world of networked, extended, decentralized politics and cultural production. And I think the way authors record their experiences makes it really hard to escape the trope of the centrality of Kyoto, because they say, the words they use for going to Kyoto and leaving Kyoto, just it builds the world around the capital city. I don't think Asakura is a little Kyoto at all. It is a completely different kind of urban center that participates in the shared culture of what in that other book I call samurai sociability, right? Of this, cultural and social rituals that warriors use to work out their relative positions in military hierarchies, to negotiate, to form alliances, and that labor happens in the provinces just as much, if not more, in this period than it happens in Kyoto. So I hope that kind of answers. Okay.
I think we are
We have one more.
Yeah.
One more question.
Sure, yeah. So thank you so much for the super interesting presentation. And I was just wondering a little bit, partially because of the evocative language you're using around rhythms and trying to kind of, in some ways, do this recuperative project to imagine kind of what things might have felt like or sounded like and so forth. And I was just wondering, in terms of sources, I was thinking a lot about like Bangai no in particular, partially because they're not generally very good. And that's interesting, I think, partially just thinking about another kind of space to think about. Arguably, no is always invested, at least in the kind of classical types, are the ones that end up being the kind of more canonical in the kind of sublimation of violence or the kind of aestheticization of that, and not unlike, say, paintings or things maps that look too nice or something like that are, and so forth. But I was also thinking about all of these other kinds of plays that in some ways do provide a space to give voice to like poetry that's not as nice or is not as kind of invested in these classical tropes, or has more of these kind of popular songs and so forth, and or even unfinished in some ways, but is also outside of the kind of Tokugawa kind of shogunate kind of sponsored ideological narrative. And so I think in the same, I was thinking about it partially when you're talking about the letters and so forth that don't have a real place, that those plays too, in some ways might be interesting as other kind of, I don't know what you would find there, but you would find a different story than you might in the kind of more standard types of sources you're looking at now. And that might give you a sense of some of these things that have been left out.
That's great. Thank you so much. I mean, it's not related to your question directly, but I will just say the Asakura were very devoted patrons of No theater, and there were no Sarugaku troops that were established in Echizen. And there's actually a famous set of not laws, but kind of a house code attributed to one of the Asakura rulers, in which he says, stop bringing in Sarugaku actors from Kyoto and instead send local actors to study in Kyoto, and then you'll have your own Sarugaku troops. So it may be a later apocryphal, but it implies that these theatrical traditions were very important to the Asakura. But of course, the plays that they loved and the actors that they worked with are gone and were killed. So we would get these kind of echoes. But I will look in those sources. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Well, thanks for all the great questions.
Sorry for prematurely cutting you off, but yes, thank you.